Thank you very much. I would also like to extend thanks to the Pontifical Academy of the Social Sciences for this very kind invitation. I'm deeply honored and privileged to be included in these discussions today. And it's a challenge to be the first speaker after lunch, but we will proceed. Thank you. In June 2021, the Government of Canada passed into law the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. This historic legislation is a step in decolonization of what we now call a settler state. The preamble of this act includes the following. Whereas all doctrines, policies, and practices based on or advocating the superiority of peoples or individuals on the basis of national origin, of racial, religious, ethnic, or cultural differences, including the doctrines of discovery and terra nullius, are racist, scientifically false, legally invalid, morally condemnable, and socially unjust. This language echoes texts from the UN Declaration itself, preambular paragraph 4, and the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination in its preamble. Why is this critically important for the decolonization of the settler state, including Canada? Or even in the international context for the decolonization of Indigenous territories around the world? And for this answer, we have to go back to the 15th century. The doctrine of discovery emanates from a series of papal bulls and extensions originating in the late 1400s and used as legal and moral justification for colonial powers taking away lands from indigenous peoples. Under these papal bulls, Christian explorers claimed lands they discovered for their Christian monarchs, who could then exploit land regardless of its original owners and occupiers. The doctrine of discovery is based on the superiority of European and Christian peoples. It was used over the past few centuries to dehumanize, exploit, and subjugate indigenous peoples and dispossess them of their most basic rights. And while we can easily reject this thinking today, such ideology led to practices that continue unabated through modern-day laws and policies in those states. Terra nullius literally means that no one owned the land prior to European assertion of sovereignty. Empty land could be taken, and by definition, land was empty if the inhabitants were not Christian. As articulated by Professor Robert J. Miller, the doctrine provided that Europeans automatically acquired property rights in native lands and gained governmental, political, and commercial rights over the inhabitants without their knowledge or consent. This legal principle was created and justified by religious, racial, and ethnocentric ideas of European and Christian superiority over other peoples. These doctrines were solidified in law in the United States of America in the early 1800s. The doctrine of discovery became a legal principle through U.S. Supreme Court decisions of the 1820s and 30s, known as the Marshall Decisions. Canadian law imported the Marshall Decisions through the St. Catharines Mining and Lumber Company versus the Queen decision of 1888. Why does this still matter? Because as recently as 2012 in Canada, the Court of Appeal in the province of British Columbia cited discovery in an attempt to continue to deny Indigenous peoples their land rights. That decision was later overturned at Canada's highest court, and yet legal systems still rely on doctrines of superiority to justify the presumed sovereignty of the Crown. How do we dismantle that, and how can the Church play a role? Former UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Professor James Anaya, concluded that the colonial era doctrine of discovery, when coupled with related doctrines of conquest and European racial superiority, has been a driving force for atrocities committed against Indigenous peoples on a global scale, with the consequences continuing to be felt. Professor Robert Williams describes most people are simply unaware that this blatantly racist European colonial era legal doctrine continues to be used by courts and policymakers in the West's nation states to deny indigenous peoples their basic human rights guaranteed under principles of modern international law. The UN Human Rights Council, by consensus, condemned doctrines of superiority as incompatible with democracy and transparent and accountable governance. Decolonization must include the dismantling of these archaic doctrines of superiority. And the path of decolonization includes the full and effective implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Indigenous peoples negotiated with states for more than 20 years to create the UN Declaration, and adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2007, and to date reaffirmed 15 times by consensus at the General Assembly. The UN Declaration has been described as a principled framework on which states can build or rebuild their relationships with indigenous peoples. The UN Declaration is a universal, remedial human rights instrument. The UN Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, of which I am currently a member, concluded more than a decade ago as a normative expression of the existing international consensus regarding the individual and collective human rights of indigenous peoples. The Declaration provides a framework for action. After an initial study on the doctrine of discovery, the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues concluded states are no longer allowed to deploy positivist legal interpretations of laws adopted during an era when doctrines such as terra nullius were the norm. International human rights law, including norms on equality and non-discrimination, such as those affirmed in the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, demand that states rectify past wrongs caused by such doctrines, including the violation of the land rights of indigenous peoples through law and policy reform, restitution, and other forms of redress for the violation of their land rights. During its 10th session, the Permanent Forum emphasized that redefining the relationship between indigenous peoples and the state is an important way to understand the doctrine of discovery and a way to develop a vision of the future for reconciliation, peace, and justice. The UN Permanent Forum went on to do a second study to examine the extensive and challenging topic of redress for the violation of human rights resulting from the doctrine of discovery. The study concludes with several recommendations for next steps that can overturn colonial doctrines to a principled human rights framework consistent with the UN Declaration and other international human rights law. In 2010, the Holy See clarified a position on doctrines of superiority, including at the United Nations. In a response to that first study done by the Permanent Forum, the Holy See stated, the fact that juridical systems may employ the doctrine of discovery as juridical precedent is therefore now a characteristic of the laws of those states and is independent of the fact that for the Church, the document has no value whatsoever for centuries. The refutation of this doctrine is therefore now under the competence of national authorities, legislators, lawyers, and legal historians. However, indigenous peoples have been asking for further steps from the Vatican, and I am very pleased to acknowledge that earlier today, the Vatican released a new statement repudiating the doctrine of discovery. There have been many appeals to the Pope to formally issue a statement that repudiates and condemns doctrines of superiority and the ongoing legacies. And this was again raised by indigenous peoples when His Holiness visited Canada in the summer of 2022. Without knowing that a new statement would be released by the Vatican today, The humble suggestion I was bringing forward was for the Vatican to work with Indigenous peoples to release a formal repudiation that is more than the previous statement of regret. And this should include efforts to address the legacy of human rights abuses. Redress and reparations for land dispossession are perhaps the most challenging provisions in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, yet we must continue having these conversations. Today's statement goes very far. It notes that the Church acknowledges that these papal bulls did not adequately reflect the equal dignity and rights of Indigenous peoples, and they are not expressions of the Catholic faith. It goes on to say that the contents of these papal bulls were manipulated for political purposes by competing colonial powers in order to justify immoral acts against Indigenous peoples that were carried out at times without opposition from ecclesiastical authorities. In the words today of Pope Francis, never again can the Christian community allow itself to be infected by the idea that one culture is superior to others, or that it is legitimate to employ ways of coercing others. The Catholic Church therefore repudiates those concepts that fail to recognize the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples, including what has become known as the legal and political doctrine of discovery. I respectfully acknowledge the tremendous significance of today's announcement for Indigenous peoples. And on behalf of myself personally and all of the Indigenous peoples who have come to this space before me, I express my sincere appreciation. In closing, I want to circle back to where I began. Canada now has both federal and provincial legislation to ensure the implementation of the UN Declaration. Other states should follow this example. And as part of this legislation, Canada announced its draft National Action Plan to ensure the implementation of the UN Declaration just about a week ago. Having the Declaration entrenched in law and implementing this international human rights instrument as the framework for reconciliation is a path of decolonization in Canada. Recognizing, respecting, and affirming Indigenous peoples' human rights is a start. The tools exist, and we look to states for the political will to make this the reality. And I want to thank the Vatican for this most recent expression of support. Thank you.